It is a conflict that has left the world in tension and a great dilemma today. The conflict between the Ukraine and Russia. Many are worried whether this could be the beginning of the Third World War. Amid all this, others are puzzled on how events in this conflict will unfold for the future. Nonetheless, others are worried as to what was the genesis of the crisis or the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine. Why is Russia invading Ukraine? And what is the position of the EU and NATO in this conflict? The CSTV travels back to history to bring you the history and the genesis of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Stay tuned and have it true and real. To understand the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, then one needs to understand the economic, political, and cultural context of this particular conflict. We go back to history. Before 1991, Ukraine was part of Russia. However, after the collapse of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became independent. Now, the fact that these two countries were once one thing is partly going to explain this conflict. Now, why do we have this conflict between Ukraine and Russia? The first one is Ukraine is of strategic importance to Russia. When you look at Ukraine, it is one of the richest countries that is situated in between the European Union and Russia. So it is one country that Russia will want either to be part of, that Ukraine is part of Russia, or will not want to be part of the European Union. Now, without Ukraine, Russia is just a big nation. With Ukraine, Russia is a superpower. Now, the second reason is the territorial conflict between Russia and Ukraine over the Donbas region and Crimea. These two regions are found on the eastern part of Ukraine, apparently the part that borders Russia. These two regions, one, they have Russian native speakers who are Ukrainians. Remember, I told you at the beginning of this video that before 1991, Russia and Ukraine were one. Now, it is naturally expected that we have people in Russia who have Ukrainian affiliation, and we have people in Ukraine who have the Russian affiliation. In the eastern part of Ukraine, we have Ukrainians who are affiliated to Russia in terms of the language, in terms of the culture, and apparently these residents on the eastern border of Ukraine to Russia actually are the pro-Russians. They support Russia politically and in everything. So what's happening is that the government of Ukraine sees these residents as separatists. They are seen as rebels because they are working against the government of Ukraine in favor of the government of Russia. And naturally, Russia has also come to support the Russian native speakers along this border, who are Ukrainians by citizenship, but everything they do it the Russian way. So we have had conflict around this region. And then another thing that we need to understand about these regions, that is the Donbas region and the Crimea region. These are the regions with the highest resources that actually have contributed to the development of Ukraine before the conflict began in this particular region. One important thing to note is the USA was very much happy when Ukraine gained its independence. Remember, after the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, the world changed to be unipolar. Now, the USA was left as the only world superpower. Remember, initially we had two superpowers, Russia and Ukraine. You know, and Russia and the USA. Automatically already, by the fact that Russia collapsed and the USA remained as a superpower, there is conflict of interest between Russia and the USA. USA has always wanted Ukraine, and even in 1994, the USA added Ukraine to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And even Ukraine has always supported USA, even in the invasion of Iraq. I stated this because later on in this video, we are going to see how the USA comes into this conflict. How did this conflict between Russia and Ukraine grow and develop to be an international conflict that right now is putting the world under attention? Then we need to understand the three categories of political parties in Ukraine, and we also understand the three presidential regimes in Ukraine. From there we can be able to add dots and find where this conflict actually started its escalation to international levels. Now, in Ukraine, we have three categories of political parties. The first one is the pro-Western, pro-NATO, pro-EU, and Russian political parties. Normally, most of these political parties are to be found towards the western side of Ukraine. The second category of political parties are anti-Western, anti-NATO, anti-USA, and pro-Russian. These parties are more inclined to the eastern part of Ukraine. And finally, we have political parties that have taken the non-alignment stand. They are neither pro-Western or pro-Russian. These ones have taken what is called the ideology of regionalism. However, when you look at this category, that is the third category of political parties, the ones that have taken non-alignment, you realize that they do not have much power or much say in the international arena where people have to portray their stance. Now, Ukraine has had 3 presidents since 2010 to date. I chose to start from 2010 because actually this is where this conflict starts to get interesting. When you look at President Viktor, who served Ukraine between 2010 and 2014, he came from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And this party was highly affiliated to the eastern side and supported Russia. Then when you look at President Petero, who served Ukraine since 2014 to 2019, he was from the European Solidarity Party, which actually was pro-EU, pro-NATO, and was anti-Russian. And then the current president, that is Volodymyr, who served the country since 2019 today, he is in the Servant of People's Party, and this party is largely pro-European, pro-nation, pro-NATO, and it advocates for the Western liberal form of democracy. From these 3 regimes, you can be able to see that we have had different regimes that have different inclinations either to Russia or to NATO, to Western or to European Union. Now, all the problems of Russia and Ukraine in this conflict began with President Viktor in 2010. This is the man who actually in one way or another sold Ukraine to the point where it is right now. Now, when he entered into power, President Viktor extended the risk for Russia's Black Sea Fleet in exchange of low gas from Russia to 2042. And in so doing, it was kind of giving Russia authority to control Crimea in exchange of raw gas. Now, we go back again to history. When Ukraine became independent, one of the major hurdles that it had with Russia was the division of the submarine fleets in the Black Sea. And Crimea is part of this Black Sea. The fact that he has extended the risk of agreement or a lease of this region to Russia up to 2042, it's like President Viktor just gave Crimea to Russia without much bargaining. And then another thing is that the USA never welcomed this mood at all and this exchange at all. Why? As I told you earlier, these regions under conflict are actually very rich in resources, and also USA wants Ukraine for its own strategic security importance. Now, again in 2010, President Victor signed a law that is to change the constitution, Article 111 of the Ukrainian constitution, to extend the term limit of the president in the country. Now, in 2013, before 2013, when he actually signed this agreement and it was mad with a lot of corruption charges, there were a lot of protests in Ukraine and people actually wanted him out of power. But to reparate his image and to paint an image that is actually in support of Ukrainians' needs and interests, in 2013, Victor supported the EU association agreement with Ukraine. So in this way, he wanted to gain the trust of the Ukrainian. However, later that year, he withdrew that agreement. He was no longer interested in the association of Ukraine to the EU. And this led to the famous protest called the Euromaidan Movement, and a protest in Kyiv, that is the capital of Ukraine. Now, if you don't understand the Euromaidan movement, actually this is a movement that came out of this regular and constant protest by Ukrainians who wanted to be part of the European Union, but the president withdrew this move. So Ukrainians have always wanted to be part of the European Union. As people, they see the European Union as a form of liberation, as a form of freedom of movement, freedom of trade, and so forth. So when the president decided to withdraw from this move, they started protest, and out of that, the Euromaidan movement was emerged. All the Euromaidan movement came into the limelight. Now, to end this protest, in 2014, an agreement of settlement was signed by the Ukrainian government. However, in April, President Victor fled the country to Russia. The political temperatures and the heat in the country was too much on him, and while this was taking place, Western Ukraine highly supported the Euromaidan movement. However, in the eastern side of Ukraine and Donbas region, the people were against these movements. They had their own protest in support of President Victor. So you see, these are the protests in one country, with the eastern side supporting President Victor, and the western side feeling bad that President Victor has betrayed them by not joining Ukraine to the EU. This is where now the conflict becomes very, very interesting. While protests were taking place in the capital of Ukraine, Russia took that particular opportunity and strategically took over Crimea, installed a pro-Russian government, conducted a referendum, and on the 16th March, Crimea was regarded as an independent country. But remember, an independent country that is kind under the control of Russia. Naturally, USA opposed this. But this is what Putin had to say. He said he would be protecting Russian speakers in Donbas region and the Crimea region. And because of this speech, the separatists and rebels in Donbas region and Crimea forces, actually, they started supporting Russia. And in so doing, the Russian government also offered military support. And why am I saying this? There's no way in this world minority groups can be able to rise against a country like Ukraine and win. They must have support. And for the minority groups in Donbas region and Crimea, their support comes from Russia. Remember, Donbas region has 2 airports, and in 2014 they sought a Malaysian plane, and the missile is said to be having a Russian origin. The missile that brought down the airplane. And this is not the first case or the only case that has been reported in this region. Where do these minority groups get all this? Definitely support by Russia. So this conflict in the eastern part of Ukraine has been escalating because the minority groups that are fighting against the Russian government seem to have a strong backup. And as a result, now the conflict has taken some international stand. On one side is the EU, NATO, and the USA. And on the other side, we have Russia, and Ukraine is the battleground. In an effort to end this conflict, in 2014 and 2015, two agreements were signed. That is the Minsk Agreement of 2014 and the Minsk Agreement 2 of 2015. Unfortunately, these two agreements failed. Why did these agreements fail? To understand this, we need to find out the terms and conditions of this agreement. On its part, Ukraine wanted ceasefire, Russia to withdraw heavy weaponry from the conflict region, and Ukraine to have control of Donbas and Crimea regions. On the other side, Russia wanted the autonomy of Donbas region, the highly prosperous region of Ukraine, and then anything else can be discussed. Unfortunately, these two countries held strongly onto their stance, and none was ready to bend, and therefore the two agreements failed. Remember, the conflict in Ukraine implies Ukraine's hardship in joining the EU, and this is something very important to Russia. Ukraine will better remain a conflicted region than a region under EU. In 2019, Ukraine got a new president, that is President Vladimir. And then, after he entered into power, he agreed to implement the Stania formula. Now, you will want to understand what is Stania formula. The Stania formula, it is a peace agreement that was supposed to be an alternative to the two failed Minsk agreements. Remember, I told you that in 2014 and 2015 there was two agreements, or two peace agreements that failed to bring Ukraine and Russia into an understanding. Now in 2019 another agreement was brought on board, but this agreement had the following conditions. 1. Ukraine to grant Donbas and Crimea autonomy after conducting elections. However, Ukraine said they want a total ceasefire, then elections can be done. You see, Ukraine is very, very much justified to say this. You cannot just develop a region, or you cannot just say that you want to grant autonomy into a country and then you have elections when another foreign country is controlling those regions. You may be developing a region and making it a fertile ground for internal attacks. But Russia wasn't either flexible in its stand. So Russia said elections first, grant autonomy to the Donbas regions, then we conduct anything else. So you see, one party, that is Ukraine, wants autonomy after conducting election, autonomy, then we conduct elections. Then Russia says elections, then anything else. So you see, it is hard stance. As a result, the Stania formula failed, just like the Minsk Agreement 1 and 2. Amid all this conflict and amid the hard stance of these two countries, the question could be, why is NATO, or why is EU, or why is USA then not helping Ukraine? Because, you know, if actually USA wants Ukraine in NATO, or wants Ukraine, why is it not actually coming on board in full swing to help Ukraine against Russia? Because truly speaking, Ukraine does not have the capacity to fight Russia as it is right now. It needs NATO and the EU support. And to understand why EU and NATO have not come in full swing in terms of combat and so forth to help fight Russia, you will know that the problem lies within EU and NATO. And this takes us back again. Why is Ukraine not part of NATO? And why is Ukraine not part of EU? Why is it like the EU or the NATO has not just granted Ukraine membership? You know, it is easy to say we want to join an organization, and it is one thing for that organization to let you in as a member. The European Union has its own fears. Number one, there will be a lot of migrations of Ukrainians from Ukraine to the rest of Europe. And we all know that Europe is not so much open to all these migrations. And secondly, when you look at NATO, if Ukraine entered as a NATO member, then it means that NATO must be ready to face Russia and engage it in a full-scale war in support of their member state. So when we look at all these outcomes that are likely to come out of Ukrainians' membership in EU and NATO, you realize that it is somehow hard small for EU and for NATO. Why? For a country like USA, it just left Afghanistan the other day. Does it have the energy to enter Ukraine as at the moment? Because Russia is not also an East power to confront. It is the second strongest country in the world in terms of military power. And then, which reason will USA give to invade Russia or to fight Russia or to enter Ukraine? Because it must have a reason that must be justified in the international arena. For Russia, they have a reason, like they are giving autonomy of the Donbas region and Crimea. It's a democratic thing. But for USA, what will it give? So you realize that the membership of Russia in Ukraine, or the membership of Ukraine in European Union, all in the NATO, has nothing to do with Ukraine. It has everything to do with NATO and EU in terms of what could be the outcome. Now, as it is right now, Russia has invaded Ukraine. Already everybody is up there blaming Putin for his aggressive, and all of a sudden now Ukraine is a battleground. A battleground because honestly this is not the war between Russia and Ukraine. It is a war between Russia and the EU and the NATO. Only that NATO and the EU have not come out in physical combat with Russia. Because the thing here is, Russia knows if Ukraine is taken, then Russia is just a big state. But if it is able to control Ukraine, then Russia is a superpower. So the question is, who will help end this war? Definitely, someone has to pend. But who will pend? For Russia, they believe they are fighting for their strategic and for their national interest. The same case applies to Ukraine. They believe they are fighting for their national interest. But the question is, how is this national interest, or how are these national interests defined? And what is the role of the EU and the NATO in this national interest, or promoting this national interest? Now, people are talking about the setting up of sanctions for Russia to stop this war. Do you think that Russia doesn't know that it is the largest supplier of gas in Europe, in the European Union, or the whole of Europe? Do you think that Russia wasn't aware that if it starts war with Ukraine, sanctions were awaiting them? because definitely these sanctions are not going to affect Russia alone. They are going to affect everybody all together, and Russia is aware of that. So in my next video, I'm going to tell you what is the role of NATO, USA, and the EU in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Stay tuned and have it raw and real. Hope you have learned from this video. Keep subscribing.